Happy Pride. So, despite the very gay history of this congregation, you know, the founder, me, well, that's gay enough, right? Arthur, it turns out, is gay. Look at him, he's got a rainbow mask on. Despite that history, it was not until the pandemic that we had a Pride Shabbat. A Pride Shabbat. There had never been one. I don't know why I didn't think of it. I guess because I was settling in and stuff. And then we were online doing a TV show, and then we had a Pride Shabbat, and then we did it again last year. And so this is our first ever in person. So on behalf of everyone, thank you guys for being here. Our readers tonight are Susie Friedman, Melanie Goldberg, Rabbi Miriam Jairus, Bruce Hellenberg, Lonnie Fleischer, and we will begin with the first slide before we light the candles. We come together this Shabbat, each bringing with us a private world of hopes, of fears, of dreams. Some of us are burdened by anxieties and cares that all but crash our hope in the future. Others have hearts filled with happiness, grateful for the joys of the past week, yet aware that even the most fortunate are vulnerable before the mystery of tomorrow. Every life is a unique blending of joy and sorrow, of fulfillment and frustration. Beneath our uniqueness, we are all bound together by our common humanity. All of us deeply yearn to know true freedom and peace. Each of us seeks the personal liberation of a mind that is not enslaved to conventional wisdom, a heart that is able to love without fear, a spirit that cries yes to our potential. Each of us strives, too, for the inner peace that comes with finding a harmony between our aspirations and our abilities. This is the Shabbat peace to which we aspire. I'd like to invite Max Lark to join me to light our Shabbat candles. Shalom, Baruch Haor, Baruch Haor, Bashabbat.
Shabbat Shalom.
Shabbat Shalom.
May the doors of our community be wide enough to receive all who hunger for love, all who are lonely for friendship. May they welcome all who have cares to unburden, gratitude to experience, hopes to nurture. May the doors of our community be narrow enough to shut out pettiness, pride, envy, and enmity. May their threshold be no stumbling block to young or unsure feet. May they be too high to admit complacency, selfishness, and harshness. May the congregation be, for all who enter, the doorway to a richer and more meaningful life.
Israel, Ma Tovu, Ohalecha Yaakov, Ohalecha Yaakov, Mishkenotecha Israel, Libra.
Shabbat Shalom. One day the words coming out will sound strange. Oppression based on gender or orientation will be a memory. History to honor and remember the pain of hiding, repressing, denying, honoring the triumphs of those who fought to be free, remembering the violence and vitriol that cost lives. When love wins at long last, love your neighbor as yourself will be as natural as breathing. One day, love will win every heart. Love will win every soul. Fear will vanish like smoke, and tenderness for all will fill our hearts. Love wins. In the end, love wins. Man for man, woman for woman, woman for man, man for woman, all genders, all orientations, all true expressions of heart. Let this come speedily in our day, a tribute to the many and the diverse, a tribute to love deep and true, each of us for one another.
Today, more than ever before, humanistic Jews stand with those in the LGBTQ community, with a special emphasis on LGBTQ people of color who are so often threatened, to ensure freedom from fear. Our humanistic philosophy insists that we all work together to end inequality, injustice, and violence. All who can protest against some wrong committed by their family and do not are accountable together with their family, says the Talmud. All who can protest against some wrong committed by a citizen of their city and do not are accountable together with all citizens of the city. All who can protest against some wrong committed by the whole world and do not are accountable together with all citizens of the world. Let us honor the resilience, struggles, celebrations, and pride of the LGBTQ community. Let us take inspiration from them and others to fight for the lives of all of our fellow citizens. Let us do so through supporting each other, honoring love, respecting the dignity of every person, resisting tyranny, voting, and protesting. For all those who suffer oppression, let us stand for peace and equality.
On this Shabbat, as we gather to celebrate Pride, let us take a moment to reflect on why some people and connections are respected or recognized by law while others are not. May our community, guided by our humanistic Jewish values, honor the beauty of human diversity by always including trans people, single people and couples, those bound by friendships or in non-traditional relationships, in intercultural unions, or who are bound by other intimacies of the heart and being. In the spirit of Tikkun Olam, let us work for ever more inclusion. May the day soon arrive when respect and civil rights are freely granted, regardless of who we are or how we choose to live our lives.
Shabbat Shalom, all my wonderful congregation. And then all that has divided us will merge, and then compassion will be wedded to power, and then softness will come to a world that is harsh and unkind. And then both men and women will be gentle, and then both women and men will be strong, and then no person will be subject to another's will. And then all will be rich and free and varied. And then the greed of some will give way to the needs of many. And then all will share equally in the earth's abundance. And then all will care for the sick and the weak and the old. And then all will nourish the young. And then all will cherish life's creatures. And then all will live in harmony with each other and the earth. And then everywhere will be called Eden once again.
Na'aseh shalom, shalom.
shalom aleinu v'al kol ha'olam ve'imru shalom. Na'aseh shalom aleinu v'al kol ha'olam ve'imru shalom. Na'aseh shalom shalom ba'olam. Na'aseh shalom aleinu v'al kol ha'olam ve'imru shalom. In this community where we find strength and common purpose, we turn our minds and hearts toward all those who need our love and support, those who are ill, those who suffer pain of the body or spirit, those who are lonely, those who have been wronged. Tonight, our well wishes are extended to these members of our community and their loved ones, to Joe Gaydon, to Rabbi Peter Schweitzer. And if there's anyone whom you're thinking about, we'll start on this side of the room. Please feel free to share. Anybody on the side? Miriam? Anybody else? Yes, Glenn. Oh, Bruce, sorry. Libby? Did we miss anyone at all? May all who suffer know they're not alone. May they be healed quickly. May they experience a refuah shlema, a complete recovery, the renewal of their bodies and the renewal of their spirits. Mekom hakoach betokeinu, mekorot habracha michebroteinu. May the source of strength that dwells so deep within us help us find the courage to make our lives a blessing, and let us say Shalom. Mekom hakoach betocheinu, mekorot habracha michebroteinu. May those in need of healing know refuah shlema, the renewal of body, the renewal of spirit, and let us say Shalom. If I should die and leave you here a while, be not like others sore undone who keep long vigil by the silent dust. For my sake, turn again to life and smile, nerving thy heart and trembling hand to do something to comfort other hearts than mine. Complete these dear unfinished tasks of mine, and I perchance may therein comfort you. Our thoughts turn to those who are no longer with us, our own loved ones, those whom our friends and neighbors have lost, the martyrs of our people whose graves are unmarked, and those of every people and nation whose lives have been a blessing to humanity. As we remember them, we meditate on the meaning of love and loss, of life and death. We recall now our loved ones whom death has recently taken from us, those who died at this season in years past, and those whom we have taken into our hearts with our own. Tonight, we observe the yahrzeits of these members of our community and their loved ones: Harry Fraser, Jerome Logan, Helen Lubeck, Hannah Master, Sam Meza, Eugene Scala, Idel Unger, and Sadie Wolberg. There's someone whom you're thinking of, who you've lost and preserve in memory. Renee? Tom? there anyone else? Yes, Bobby. I saw another name, Saul. Anybody that we missed? Yehi zichram livracha, we say, may their memories be a blessing, meaning that we hope that the cherished and beautiful memories we shared with them will bring us blessing and comfort as we face life in their absence. If you can do so comfortably, please rise as together we recite our humanistic interpretation of Kaddish. Nit gadal v'nit kadash beruach ha'adam. Let us dignify and ennoble all people in the spirit of our shared humanity. Let us proclaim the preciousness of life. Let us show gratitude for life by approaching it with reverence. Let us embrace the whole world, even as we wrestle with its parts. Let us, each in our own way, take up our share in serving the world and seeking truth. May our commitment to life help us to strengthen healing of spirit and peace of mind. May justice and peace permeate and comfort the house of Israel and all those who dwell on earth. And let us say, Ken Yehi, may it be so. Please be seated. Before we get too far into my talk, before we get into my talk at all, just a reminder that Monday night is our annual meeting. It is in person, although it'll also be simulcast on Zoom. There's a link that was sent out to all the members. If you are planning to attend, we're hoping to have an outdoor picnic before a potluck, I should say, beforehand at 6 o'clock. The meeting itself starts at 7. As usual, masks are required until that little traffic light on the CDC thing turns green again, and we can go. So last week, Arthur and I spent actually a very, very lovely afternoon in Ferndale at the Pride celebration. There's another one tomorrow, and they do it also on Sunday. I can't remember. I like the Ferndale one the best. One of the things I could not help, and I can't help but notice every time I go to a Pride celebration, especially in the last 10, 15 years, is the array of churches. And there was one synagogue, though. They were a little bit lonely. The array of churches that were there. And it reminded me of nothing more than when a friend of mine said to me 20 some odd years ago, you just wait. One day, the Christians are going to take credit for gay equality. And that's okay with me. If they want to take credit for that, that's fine. We have expanded our rainbow. As you can see, the flag has changed. It's actually changed again, but I couldn't get the new one that includes intersex people to remind us of trans people and non-binary people and all kinds of people who love differently and live differently than traditions have taught them. And what we're going to talk about tonight is those traditions. Now, I'm primarily a scholar of, if I can call myself that humbly, Judaism and with a little bit more knowledge of Christianity, not so much Islam. I'm not going to say too much about Islam tonight as we make our way through the two dominant American religions, at least that we're making and creating noise and politics over the last many years during from gay pride starting in the 1920s till now. But I will say this, when I was at Pride, and it's not the first time, but this time it was especially lovely to see a woman, and it's just randomly, because I'm sure there were others there, a woman in a hijab and her son. She had a prominent gay pride t-shirt on. He was waving the flag. It was a beautiful thing to see. Arthur and I, when we arrived here about 8 years ago, we went down to some art festival, and I remember meeting a young woman with a hijab who also had a big rainbow pin to it. So, you know, as we consider the diversity of America and Americans, I did not want to exclude them, but for me to comment on Islam as if I have some special knowledge of it, that wouldn't be good. So we're going to start with the history of Christianity and homophobia. I'm not going to bore you with a lot, but I do want to share where we've come from, at least in the last 50, 60, 70 years, and where we're going. Not so much we, but then. So just a reminder before I start, when we talk about the distant past in Christendom and Judaism, we have to remember that there was no real discussion of gay identity. That wasn't a thing. LGBT people did not have a specific, they didn't have a compass or even a way to form that identity. It was not part of the world they lived in. Doesn't mean they weren't there. They were absolutely there. There were people who felt that they were misgendered. There were people who felt that who were blocked from loving the people they want to love. And there were many other queer people. And I should make a little parenthesis right now. LGBTQ is a lot to say every time I say it. The Q is there for a reason. And as a kid who grew up hearing queer, 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 fag, 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 I'm not so crazy about fag, but I'm going to take queer. So that's what you're going to hear. It's going to be a sort of a catch-all. Remember what it used to mean. Remember what it means now. So I'm going to use that term queer as a catch-all for LGBTQIA and else. And if you have questions about it, I can answer them later. Back to my main talk. There was no identity. We didn't have identities like that, but clearly people were engaging in what were considered forbidden relationships, or people had identities that did not match with what the culture condoned. We also know that outside the Christian world, and the Jewish people were primarily living in the Christian world, with many at certain times in the Islamic world as well, there were cultures specifically that had third genders or non-binary ways of looking at the world. A Native American culture, if you're interested, you can Google that easily. We also have to keep in mind that when we talk about the American religious struggle, which is what my topic is primarily tonight, we're talking about four basic areas. One is the larger societal discrimination that they were willing to, and in many cases are still willing to, tolerate. The second is rights like marriage for same-sex couples and so forth, and hopefully someday opening up to people in other ways as well. And then very specific, sort of more parochial issues of LGBTQ, I said I wasn't going to go through the whole alphabet, there I did, of queer people and their churches, and how they should be treated in their own religious communities, since that's the topic. And finally, the place of queer people as clergy. So this is what religions primarily have been dealing with. Now in Christianity, much of the prohibition, much of the attitude is based upon Jewish writings, because the Hebrew Bible, which they call, of course, the Old Testament, has the specific prohibitions that we'll talk about on not lying with a man as you lie with a woman. We'll get to that in a little bit more depth when I talk about the Jewish piece of this. But they were inspired by that. They were also inspired in terms of judging the morality or appropriateness or naturalness of the whole thing by verses such as Genesis 2, verse 24. Therefore shall a man leave his father and mother and shall cleave unto his wife, and they shall be one flesh, and be fruitful and multiply, and all those other kinds of things. Jesus, as it turns out, said nothing. There's a passage in the book of Mark, in the Gospel of Mark, where he does quote this with some changes, but he's talking about divorce. He's not talking about queer people at all, or about radical relationships. Today's Christians continue to rely on this. They also love to cite for moral reasons stories like Sodom and Gomorrah. Sodom and Gomorrah, the famous story of the angels who, after leaving Abraham and Sarah's tent and announcing that this 100-plus-year-old woman was going to have a baby, it's mythology. So they head over to Sodom to meet Abraham's nephew Lot, because they're going to help him out. And they wind up going in and being taken care of by him, but the whole townspeople come over and they send your people out, send those men out so we can have our way with them. And he offers his virgin daughters, which calls into question much of Lot's morality as well. But we have a parallel story to this too, where it makes it very clear that they were talking about hospitality and not necessarily sex. But the Christian interpretation and many Jewish interpretations treat this as some kind of moral issue dealing with people's sexual behavior. Paul has a couple of little places where he exhorts about sexual immorality, but no details. And he talks about adultery, and he talks about idolatry. And that brings us to the 19th and 20th century, when people really began to be aware of a growing group of people who were different places and cities. The urbanization helped with it. who were behaving abnormally as far as they were concerned. And then Christianity begins to take strong positions on things. And that's where we are today. And today's Christians are deeply divided on this issue. Catholicism, which I'm going to spend very little time on, as unitary a whole as it seems to be, is quite divided. But more on tone than on actual rules or making anything better for anyone. They have taken the stance that homosexual behavior is forbidden, but not homosexual feelings. Gee, thanks. The current pope, as we know, he's been somewhat compassionate in the ways that he's spoken about gay and lesbian people. I don't think he's addressed trans at all. But there's been no policy changes in the church. And remember, this is a church that still will not ordain women as priests and will hold on to that tenaciously, nor let priests marry, despite the fact that they have a very, very big shortage of priests. When it comes to trans people's rights and dignity, the Catholic Church is quite exactly where you would expect them to be, and not a lot of compassion. In 2019, the Vatican released a paper they called Male and Female, He Created Them, toward a path of dialogue. It doesn't sound like dialogue when you read it, on the question of gender theory and education. It was their first extensive statement about it. It did call for love and respect, so you get that sort of little, compassionate version of Catholicism there. But it rejected the idea that gender is distinct from biological sex and so forth, saying, this doesn't sound very compassionate to me, a transgender identity seeks to annihilate the concept of nature. Personally, I think burning down the world annihilates the concept of nature. But okay, if we're going with transgender identity, I suppose that's what the Vatican wants to say, and they said it. Now, fortunately, we've had in the Christian world, on the Protestant side, a lot more debate that has mattered. It took many years for open responses, for the number of churches at the Pride festivals to increase to whatever they were last week, and it wasn't small. It was started by the Unitarians, and I have to then, of course, insert the notion that many don't consider them Christians. Many of them are not Christians. They're humanists. But at the time that they started this, it was something to see a Protestant, old line, mainline church rise up in favor of gay rights. Another was the United Church of Christ. I know we get mixed up with all the churches of Christ, but the United Church of Christ is an old mainline church and unbelievably positive about queer rights. There were some laggers that finally came around. The Church of England and their sibling congregations over here, the American Episcopalian Church and the Canadian version, they did. But other Anglicans have actually created a schism over this, particularly those in Africa, South America, and in places that have not been part of the queer rights movements. The Lutherans, now you may know some Lutherans who are very right-wing, but those are the Missouri guys. I don't know why it's named after Missouri. And Wisconsin, yes. Well, I've mostly run into the Missouri Synod, as it's called. I think the Wisconsinians are part of that Missouri Synod. And then we have ELCA, the Evangelical Church in America, which is very liberal, even though the word evangelical is in there. So you can't judge anybody by what their names are. Presbyterians, lately Methodists, although they had a big fight about it. But the majority of the Christian world, even if it does appear to be shifting slightly, consists of mostly conservative Protestants, evangelicals as they are sometimes misnamed. Southern Baptist Convention is the largest of the organized groups. Some of them are independent, some of them belong to many other churches, charismatic churches, places where you might have seen them on television speaking in tongues or glossolalia and that kind of thing. But the Southern Baptist Convention is what I chose to show where we are in the state of Christianity. They, by the way, just released a multi-hundred-page book of revelations about decades of sexual abuse of both adults and minors throughout their churches all over North America that had been covered up by their Southern Baptist Convention for decades and decades. These people are going to have a lot of financial problems to deal with, and I couldn't be happier. Listen to some of their statements, and you'll know why. Even a desire to engage in a homosexual relationship is always sinful, impure, degrading, shameful, unnatural, indecent, and perverted. In the spirit of Christ, Christians should oppose all forms of sexual immorality, including adultery, homosexuality, and pornography. Love the sinner, hate the sin. I know it sounds like the Catholics, but if you experience this, it's really hate the sinner, hate the sin. Gender identity, they wrote recently, this just came out, is determined by biological sex and not by one's self-perception, a perception which is often influenced by fallen human nature in ways contrary to God's design. That's the narrative of the fall of man from the book of Genesis as they understand the story of Adam and Eve. So as a rabbi, even a humanistic rabbi, I have to let the Christians fight their own fight and hopefully stay out of the way of the rest of us. But the rest of us include my folks, so I'm going to spend the rest of the time talking about them, since I have some specific personal and professional familiarity with it. So most of Judaism, as I mentioned, has opposed homosexuality, and I'm using words that they would use, due to two verses in the book of Leviticus. The book of Leviticus is a very harsh book, and also contains some internal contradictions as well. But one in Leviticus 18 says, "Do not lie with a male as one lies with a woman. It is an abomination." And the other one says, "If a man lies with a male as with a woman, both of them have committed an abomination. They shall be put to death. Their blood is upon them." That's pretty harsh stuff. But remember that in Judaism, depending on where you lie on the spectrum, your attitude towards Jewish law, and more importantly, toward how you interpret Jewish law, is determined by a variety of other factors. Judaism is essentially legalistic. The halakha, the Jewish law, halachic is the adjective for it. Honestly, does not address anything but the act of a man having sex with a man. Nothing here about lesbianism. It is prohibited, but it's prohibited by the rabbis, and anyone who studies Jewish law knows that a rabbinical assertion of law that is not tagged directly to a Torah verse is actually at a very low level of transgression compared to what we just read about men. The word abomination sounds really terrible in English. It's not that much better in Hebrew, I'm not going to lie. But it primarily applies and attaches to things like idolatry or improper sacrifices or other kinds of ritual transgressions in the Torah and the rest of the Bible, leading some scholars to say toeva is really about ritual. This is a way of removing the discussion about morality from it and putting it on the level of whether you drive on Shabbat or not. That's an interesting take, and it will affect particularly the conservative and Orthodox groups that I'm going to talk about in a few moments. But before we get to our friends there, let's talk about the movement that, at least the major movement, I'll talk about Reconstructionism later, very briefly, but the movement that really, I think, had the most duty, did the worst at the beginning, and wound up being the champions of queer rights, and that's Reform Judaism. Now, I am always sorry to say that Reform Judaism did not step into this discussion until 1977. And by then, a lot had already happened in the queer world and in the search for LGBTQ rights. But by the time they did, they were on the right track. Did not take them as long as the other movements, these particularly conservative Judaism, to respond in an appropriate way. But still, as late as the 1980s, they had only spoken to the civil issues regarding queer people and not addressed their own internal Reform Jewish rituals, rabbinate, and so forth. The good news is, what did they say about homosexuality, as the statement called it? The Central Conference of American Rabbis, that's the Reform Rabbinical Association, still called that, passed a statement in 1977 saying that they have consistently supported civil rights and civil liberties for all people. Remember, they were outstanding during the civil rights movement, especially for those from whom these rights and liberties have been withheld. They noted that homosexuals have in our society long endured discrimination, and they resolved, quote, "We encourage legislation which decriminalizes homosexual acts between consenting adults." That one I find hysterically parochial, because 15-year-olds never have sex. Prohibits discrimination against them as persons, and further urge our Reform religious organizations to undertake programs in cooperation with the whole Jewish community to implement this stand. But sadly, I have to say, they continued to discriminate themselves. I was ordained from the Reform movement's Hebrew Union College Jewish Institute of Religion in 1989. The policy to admit openly queer students to the College Institute was not implemented until 1990-91. That's late for Reform Jews. 1967, they admitted the first woman. And that was some 33 years after the first woman had in actuality been ordained in Berlin. But unfortunately, the Holocaust and the events in Germany wiped that one out. You would think they would have taken a page from this and started earlier. But Reform institutions continued to discriminate, and it was well understood by people like me that you could not be a gay rabbi. And in fact, what happened was that congregations with already gay people, some of them began to split off and form their own inclusive gay congregations. Sharei Zahav, Gates of Gold in San Francisco, Beit Simchat Torah in New York. There was one, and I don't remember the name of it, in Miami, Fort Lauderdale at one point, and there were a few others as well. Speaking to the lack of inclusion that Reform Jews were feeling in the Reform congregations. In any case, they did eventually come around. One of the moments that they do have to be proud of before all of this was their advocacy for HIV/AIDS assistance and research and care for its victims, which was very early on. In 1996, they finally endorsed same-sex marriage. Again, a little bit late. Not until 2000 did they issue an official statement supporting rabbinical officiation. And they talked about it being worthy of affirmation through Jewish ritual. Recognizing the diversity of opinions in their ranks, however, they declared their support for both those who chose to perform the same-sex unions and those who refused. And I would say that today, knowing the Reform movement as I do, 26 years later, I don't think there's much tolerance for those who refuse anymore. And I'm happy to say that. It is really not a stance that is justifiable in any way if you have a Reform outlook on Judaism. They also resolved at that time to develop educational and liturgical resources in the area, and boy, did they keep that promise. There are prayer books, there are home ritual guides, there are commentaries on the Torah and commentaries on other rabbinical and Jewish works that are all either extraordinarily sensitive to queer issues or that start from a queer point of view. And it's really amazing, completely supportive. Finally, in 2003, they took the 1997 document, this one that I just read, not the one I just read, but the one about civil rights, and they extended it to a document that they called Support for the Inclusion and Acceptance of the Transgender and Bisexual Communities. This leaves Reform Judaism to this day as the single largest Jewish organization, not denomination, organization in the world committed to queer rights. And that, I think, is something to be proud of. I'll talk a little bit more about the Reform movement just briefly when I share some personal background with you. What about conservative Judaism? Well, here comes a tiny bit about my personal life. Many of you have heard that I was a different kind of rabbis at different times. And maybe wondered, how does he go from being a Reform rabbi to a conservative rabbi, back to a Reform rabbi, and back to, finally, the place I felt that I belonged? What is it now, 15 years almost? here in the 13 years here in humanistic Judaism? Well, it had everything to do with my sexual orientation and my hiding from the world. And this is not uncommon. Usually you hear about it when someone who belongs to a traditional religious group is outed by their own behavior, or, sadly, because some political person does it. I don't think that's fair to them. But the reason, of course, is why is that the repression creates a very strong need, or at least did 20 some odd, 30 some odd years ago for me, a certain desire to find an authenticity, an authentic road. And in Judaism, the authentic road is defined traditionally anyway, not that I believe this, but it's defined traditionally as a halachic life, an observant life, a Sabbath observant life, a prayer-filled life, all of that kinds of thing, including traditional marriage. I wanted children very badly. I think those of you who know me know that I'm just a little bit attached to my children and my grandkids. Well, there was no route for me that I saw in the mid-1980s other than heterosexual marriage that was going to get that for me. And it's not that I desired to deceive anyone, I was deceiving myself. We could talk about the psychological ramifications of that, maybe with my friend Dr. Hillenberg another time, but I assure you, I've had the therapy to deal with it. When I decided to join the conservative movement, it was a result of their policies in the early 90s. They had adopted a sort of version of what I'll call love the transgressor and deal with the transgression. So the transgressor would have been I, and the transgression was what they, I think, more compassionately viewed as a ritual lapse of doing what the Torah said not to do. There's a lot of dumb laws in the Torah, right? Not wearing fabric that's made of animal and plant fibers mixed together, and the warp and the come on. Nobody knows what that is. The Talmud doesn't know what that is. And these conservative rabbis were honest enough to say, we don't know why this is in there, but it's in there. So live a Torah life and deal with it. Just like a person, this was an example that was given to me, just like a person without arms can't put on tefillin. A person who is constitutionally gay has to deal with the fact that they may not be able to marry a woman, or that they may have to marry a woman or whatever, but they can't practice it. That sounded good to me. That sounded like authenticity in Judaism. And as I said, later I found out that I was not alone. I was part of a phenomenon. There was nothing unique about this. 1992, the Conservative Rabbinical Assembly voted by a majority of 2/3 for a responsum, 64 pages long, and I read every word of it thousands of times, written by a rabbi named Joel Roth, that restricted all religious privileges of leadership and access to rituals from queer, at the time we were talking about same-sex, conservative Jews. Now, fortunately, I can say happily that that was overturned, but it was not overturned in time for me. Not that I would have stayed in the conservative movement. It became clear to me why I had joined had much more to do with this uniformity and authenticity and being able to think about tefillin more than I thought about who I was going to be with, or the fact that my marriage wasn't doing so well. When they found out, however, and I came out in 1998, that I was gay, the reception was lukewarm. And they made it very clear to me, and by then it was already clear that I wasn't one of them, that I should seek affiliation elsewhere. So that's how I became a conservative rabbi. And the reason I became a reform rabbi again is because I wrote a letter to the CCAR, and I told them the whole story. And Joe Glazer, who was the president at the time, a saint, a tzaddik, he wrote back to me and he said, "Yours is not the first or the 50th letter I've received like this. You are welcome back. And you may not know this, but the rabbi of your temple is a reform rabbi in good standing, because I have never stopped paying my dues. to the Reform movement. I am very, very proud of their history. And though I do not believe in God and don't belong there, and they made that clear in a whole other thing, I am nothing but filled with admiration for so much of what Reform Judaism has done. All right, let's go to Orthodox Judaism. This is where the controversies continue in many ways. So first of all, I've taught you all many times, hopefully you remember it, Orthodox Judaism is not a monolith. Far from it. There is a very large spectrum. Now, halachic Jewish legal adherence is required by all. But within that framework, there are a lot of differences too. That's another night, another lecture, another talk. There are on the left, leaning towards the middle, the modern Orthodox, meaning they live in the modern world. They dress largely like we do, and they adopt many of the attitudes we do. I would say they're probably, in the last election, they were at 50-50 on both sides, and Israel plays a big role in that as well. And as you move further right, we get into the so-called ultra-Orthodox, that are called the Haredim, which, as I mentioned, include the Hasidim, who are kind of mystically minded, and also the Yeshivish, who are more study-oriented, although that's, again, a little bit simplistic. But across the spectrum of Orthodox practice, the consensus view is that gay sex and marriage are inconsistent with Jewish practice. What does that mean, however? Well, they divide basically into two approaches, and we know there are two approaches because there's two basic groups that have put forth statements. So the first is what I'm just going to call the liberal approach, or the more open approach. It was articulated in 2010 in a statement of principles on the place of Jews with a homosexual orientation in our community. We Jews love long titles, don't we? It was drafted by the faculty of the somewhat liberal Orthodox Rabbinical School up in Riverside, New York, known as Yeshivat Chovevei Torah, a legitimate Orthodox yeshiva. Some of you took my class. They used to call themselves the Open Orthodox. For a very long time, well, somewhat long time, the head of that yeshiva was Rabbi Asher Lopatin. And if you know his name, it's because he is currently the head of our JCRC right here in Detroit, our neighbor in Huntington Woods. By the way, spoke at our movement's Jews for a Secular Democracy event last week in favor very strongly of the separation of religion and state. Did a great job, and we appreciate it. So what did this group say? Well, they acknowledge the halachic Jewish legal ban on homosexual sex, and they reject acceptance within the Jewish framework of same-sex marriage, but they did assert that gay people should be welcomed as full and equal members of Orthodox communities, and that they should not be encouraged to change their orientation, nor pressured to marry outside their will. Recently, I read from a Chabad rabbi writing an essay about how does he as a Chabad rabbi deal with it. And he said, all Jews are welcome. I honor the dignity of everyone. What we do ritually is so much more than that, and on and on and on. Look, it's not my point of view, but it's also not nasty. The other opinion from the more rightward group, a group of ultra-Orthodox rabbis with some modern mixed in, and a disturbing number of traditional Orthodox mental health professionals, they wrote a statement in 2011 as a response to this, called the Declaration on the Torah Approach to Homosexuality. And they certainly called for compassion for those struggling with gay desires, as they called them. But they rejected the notion that homosexuality, this is all their words, is an essentially unchangeable orientation, because God would not have allowed that. God would want us to change. And because of this, they have been big supporters of that hated and dangerous, deadly conversion therapy. Now, younger Orthodox Jews are beginning to fight back. There is a wonderful social justice organization called Uri Letzedek, My Light Towards Justice, Orthodox group, one that I support because I love and support my own Orthodox children and my grandchildren. I want them to know about social justice values and how they can make them work with Sabbath observance and kashrut and those kinds of things. What did they state? On their website, they say that granting basic rights to the LGBT community is an issue of basic economic justice, legal equality, and human dignity. They recognize that traditional law in Judaism has not established a model for gay marriage, but that doesn't have anything to do with what societies have the urgency to forward. They said, we have no right to coercively prevent, by force of civil law, an individual from enjoying true happiness and fulfilling their life potential when it poses no harm to any other. And then they go on to talk about, we're not speaking regarding any specific law, but we believe that the entire ethos of the Torah, talked about it tonight, love your neighbor as yourself, right? The entire ethos of the Torah, the grander scheme of the Torah, they say, demands this. And then they have links to a number of queer Jewish organizations, none of them necessarily Orthodox, most of them not, pluralistic array, articles by Orthodox Jews supporting gay civil marriage. And I'm going to share a little anecdote with you. So my daughter worked, she actually now works for a conservative day school, but up until last year, she worked for a modern Orthodox school in Baltimore. And one day she starts sending me these pictures of kids playing on the playground. I think these were fifth graders, fourth, fifth graders. These are girls, they're sitting in a circle and they're playing a little wedding game. They've made a chuppah out of popsicle sticks, and they've made little invitations, and they have the two sticks, and they're acting out a whole wedding. That's very nice. Okay, thank you for that. The third picture is the invitation with a rainbow on the front. Welcome to the chuppah, the wedding, as they say. Chuppah. Welcome to the chuppah of, I think it was Oliver and Wendell or something like that. Because I think they wanted to make the word Wenver out of it. And then you open it up, and what does it say? Another rainbow. Love is love. Now, I cannot tell you, and I'm pretty sure their parents will never watch this video, what their parents would have thought about it. But I suspect that some of them may have been okay with it, because there is a change taking place in the Orthodox community. Now, if it took Reform Judaism 50 years, it could take Orthodoxy a hell of a lot longer. But when they finally get there, I would be remiss if I did not mention that it will be in part due to the very first out gay rabbi, Stephen Greenberg, an acquaintance of mine, who was featured in a 2001 documentary called Trembling Before God, a documentary that we were traipsing all over the place, and I knew some of the people, one of the women couples especially, I got to know, who were in it, and showed the struggles of Orthodox gays and lesbians. It brought it, for the first time for many of their families, a sympathetic portrayal and what they dealt with. Because most of them were still observant. And it was painful to watch the conversations that they would have, a very obligatory blessing that the father would call, "You okay? You still alive? Yes, Shabbat Shalom. Here's your blessing." And not what I share with my daughters before Shabbat begins. Rabbi Stephen Greenberg, I should also mention, if you're interested in his point of view, wrote a book called Wrestling with God and Men, Homosexuality in the Jewish Tradition, in which he interprets those two verses in the Torah as speaking about rape. And there's some indication that it certainly might have been talking about something other than a loving sexual intimacy between two people. Now, I realize that I've given a little bit short shrift to the trans community, and I understand that. That's because these religious communities have only just begun dealing with it, so they're not part of the history yet. And I will also say that many of my friends in the older gay and lesbian community have struggled with this as well. Just so you know that this is not something that just heterosexual people think about. And I'm very, very proud to see that this flag was changed to represent people of color and trans people. The new one I mentioned, there's a yellow triangle now with a purple O in it, a complete circle. Remember the intersex people, folks who were born with indeterminate as far as genitalia or not particular set of genitalia and had surgeries forced upon them. which is part of the same spectrum of distrust, fear, hatred of people with non-binary and other non-traditional identities. The Reform movement, as I mentioned, did much more quickly jump to become inclusive of gender non-binary people and trans people by extending that, and it happened overnight, and that was a beautiful thing to see. It's necessary because right now we are dealing with a kind of hysteria in our nation over trans rights that is abusive in the extreme. One state legislature, I believe maybe in Ohio, just passed a bill. They're going to inspect every young woman to make sure her genitalia align with the sport she plays in. There will be many, many other intrusions into people's personal lives, and just as worrisome, perhaps even dangerous, not even perhaps, for sure dangerous, will be the withholding of gender-affirming medical care and surgeries, as we're seeing right now in many states. We, as humanistic Jews, we must be in the forefront of making sure that that particular level of hatred does not kill people. So whereas I've respected the Reform for so many years, I have noticed that the conservatives, having taken forever to deal with homosexual rights, they jumped on the bandwagon. This goes to show a generational difference and what that can do. And in 2016, they passed a resolution, their rabbis did, affirming commitment to full welcome, acceptance, and inclusion of people of all gender identities in Jewish life and general society, encouraging programs affiliated with the movement, the seminary, schools, synagogues, camps, blah, 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 et cetera, to educate themselves about their employees, about the needs of transgender and non-gender conforming people and non-conforming people, to create fully inclusive settings. Also encouraging all of those institutions to work toward becoming explicitly welcoming spaces, safe spaces for gender non-conforming people and transgender people, to evaluate physical site needs, workplace needs, and language. And finally, to respect how people describe themselves by the identity, name, and pronoun of their choice, and to urge all elements of government to review their policies to ensure the full equality of transgender people under the law. That pronoun issue, by the way, which I did write about, because some of you had asked me to in a commentary a few months ago, I want to point out that there is even a Jewish value that requires us to address people by the names that they prefer, the titles that they honor. That's how we show their dignity, show respect for their dignity. And I do want to tell you, the latest thing just appeared in the Jewish press this week. Doesn't really matter to us, and many of you may not be aware, but you've been hopefully now and then to a traditional synagogue, and you know at the Torah reading, they call someone up by their Hebrew name, son of or daughter of their mother, father's Hebrew name. What about gender non-binary people? They actually came up with a halachic answer for that. Instead of calling up Aryeh Label ben Tzviya, they would call up Aryeh Label mi beit Tzviya, calling up Aryeh Label, that's my Hebrew name, from the house of Tzviya. Isn't that nice? Just a little thing like that. Finally, in Orthodoxy, transgender identity has been treated similarly to the other issues, although it raises new ones as well. But they are fortunate to have a group of leaders, albeit small, supported by groups like Uri Litzedek, and a rabbi named Abby Stein, who is the first openly transgender woman raised in a Hasidic community. These are her words. She is a direct descendant of Hasidic Judaism's founder, 18th century, 17th centuries, 17th century. Baal Shem Tov, right? Yes. Looking for the century. Know me in numbers. 2015, she founded the first support group nationwide for trans people of Orthodox Jewish backgrounds, and no small number of people have sought her assistance and her help in feeling included in both their Jewish community and welcomed by the world. All right, just as I come to my conclusion, you'll say to yourself, you didn't talk about Reconstructionist Judaism. I didn't have to. They did everything right. Good for them. Problem was they were very small, and we're even smaller. For the rest of the Jewish world, they look like a fly. We look like a flea on the fly. But that's size. That's not importance. That's size. So I want to give big shout out to the Reconstructionist world for always showing the way, even if no one else would pay attention. And then finally, I would be remiss if I didn't point out what I mentioned at the beginning of services, that we are sitting in the home of a congregation that was founded by a gay man. Now, it was not easy back when Sherwin was doing these things. It was a movement that he started conceptually in the late 1950s and for real in the 1960s. Coming out as a rabbi was almost impossible. And I did not know that Sherwin had actually done a lot for gay rights. And in fact, it was something that I sought to find out. Knowing how hard it was for me in the mid-'80s as a young Jew in my 20s, and facing all of these realities, I could only imagine what it was like for him. He was many decades older than me. And I discovered that he had been as courageous there as he had been in other places, even if you didn't know about it. Now, he didn't keep it a secret. People who knew, right? Some of you knew very well. Some of you didn't. But in the gay community, people knew, and they appreciated what he had done. He was, according to Professor Tim Retzloff, whom I interviewed for our online Pride Shabbat last year, professor of LGBTQ studies, gender studies, and orientation studies at Michigan State, who specialized in the history of Michigan's, what used to be called gay liberation movement. He spoke to me about how Rabbi Wein had supported what was then a brand new fledgling organization called the Michigan Organization for Human Rights, and that he had almost single-handedly raised all the money necessary to get them an office, a staff, and everything they needed to get their first year going. They were the organization that became the roots, the seed really, of the roots of the tree of the gay, lesbian, bisexual, and transgender and queer struggle here in Michigan. So we have a lot to thank Rabbi Wein for again. Look, I don't have to tell you all that humanism is about this, as it is about any issue relating to human rights and dignity. Tomorrow afternoon, we're going to have a 13-and-a-half, 14-year-old girl, she got delayed a little by the pandemic, is going to talk about her vision of humanism. And one of the things that she points out, because she's doing this against the background of Darwinism and evolution and what the impact was on the world, is to point out that the world lost, through Darwin, this idea that humans were specially created, the special product of a deity designing us. That went out the window. But what we gained, she's going to teach her friends and family as she celebrates tomorrow, what we gained is a different kind of specialness, an awareness that all the uniqueness we need to celebrate is what we offer each other. Our diversity, our different ways of looking at the world, our different ways of loving and of celebrating. When I went to the JCC, the year 2000, Orthodox rabbis rose up against my hiring there. When I came to this congregation, no one asked a word. You only celebrated and hired Arthur and me to come along with him. So I want to acknowledge humanistic Judaism in my final breath tonight as a movement that continues to keep the promise that Rabbi Wein and you all put together, fighting for the human rights of people that you at the time probably didn't know, and which have become so central to our community, so giving, and so contributory in so many ways. So thank you for letting me share this with you tonight. Happy Pride, everybody. That's what we say. And we will We will have our own egg Shabbat tonight. The bat mitzvah party is set up in there, but the food should be going to be in the hall. Oh, it's raining. Okay. So understandably, some of you will not stay because of the mask issue, and I understand that. But I hope that you will join us. Miriam, did I miss something? What? Oh, thank you. Don't ask me how old I am, because I'm not going to tell you. Peace be with you, love be with you, and joy be with you. Peace be with you wherever you go. Peace be with you whatever you do. Peace be with you till we meet again. Peace be with you, my friend. Love be with you wherever we go. Love be with you whatever we do. Love be with you till we meet again. Love be with you, my friend. Joy be with you wherever you go. Joy be with you whatever you do. Joy be with you till we meet again. Joy be with you, my friend. Shalom Aleichem, Shalom, Shalom. Shalom Aleichem, Shalom, Shalom. Shalom Aleichem, Shalom, Shalom. Shalom Aleichem, Shalom. Thank you to Ezra. Thank you to David Weeks for the streaming, to Arthur for putting on the service, and thank you to all of you for coming. Shabbat Shalom.